For this next video, we'll be going over a little bit of connection design and then talking about our status display and how we can set up different status displays to view different things inside of our model. So to start out with, most of our connections for our members were set to auto standard. So to show what I'm talking about here, I'm just going to come up here and I'm going to double click to edit this beam member. And within our beam edit window, we can come down here and under our left and right end settings for our connection type, our input connection type is set to auto standard. So like I said, this was the case for most of our members inside of this model. If I wanted to, I could come down here and I could change both my left and right end settings to be something from auto standard, and I could change it to be user defined, plain end, bearing, clip angle, end plate, shear, seated, splice plate, or a fully welded moment. Now we could change some of these settings for our auto standard connections. So right now, if I cancel out of this window, we can see that the type of connection that it's making to this column is an end plate connection. So let's say if I only wanted to change the connection type for this one beam, it might be easier for me to just open this up and come down here, and let's say we wanted it to be a shear type connection. If I change it to shear and say OK, and if I look at my left end, we can see that this shear connection is now made because it's specified to a shear connection. Now, if I wanted all of my auto standard connections to be shear plate instead of end plate, we could go into our project settings and change that. So let's go ahead and go take a look at where we could change that. So if I minimize my modeling window and go to my project settings on my home screen, so I'm already there, I'll click on my project settings again. Within our job settings, under our connections tab, we can see that we have auto standard connections. So if I click on my auto standard connections, this is going to pull up my auto standard connections window, and in here is going to list a bunch of different framing type conditions. So to start off with, we would have to choose if our connection type is from a beam to a beam, or if it's from beams to columns or to concrete supports. There's a couple different ones in here, so from columns to beams, or from columns to columns, or from joists to beams, from joists to columns, or from joists to concrete supports. I'm going to just stick with the from beams to columns since that's what we were looking at there. And once I highlight the two columns, then it's going to give us each different framing condition that we can have inside of our model for each of our different material types. So right at the top here, you see we have a channel beam to pipe column, a channel beam to tube column, a channel beam to wide flange column. So there's a whole bunch of different framing conditions in here. The one that we happen to be looking at, and the one that happens the most inside of our model that we have here, is our wide flange beams to wide flange columns, since that's the type of members we were using inside of this model. So if I keep scrolling down here, we can come to the section where we have wide flange beams. So this is a wide flange beam to pipe column, this is a wide flange beam to tube column, and down here is our wide flange beam to wide flange column. So in our particular situation that we were looking at, if I pull this back up here, this is a wide flange beam and it's framing into a wide flange column. So that would be the framing condition that we would want to find inside of our auto standard connections. So we do have a couple different framing conditions of that instance. We have a flange skewed, flange offset skew, flange perpendicular, flange offset perpendicular, web skew, web offset skew, web perpendicular, or web offset perpendicular. And then I can click through these, and it's going to give me a little summary of what this input connection type is set to. So in that particular instance of what we were looking at in our model would have been the wide flange beam to wide flange column, web perpendicular. So we can see that the input connection type for that is end plate, and that's the type of connection that it was giving us. So this is where you'd want to go to be able to change that type of input connection if it was set to auto standard connection. So I can double click on this to bring up this auto standard connection window here. And here's where I could change my input connection type to, let's say if I wanted it to be shear or seated, splice plate, clip angle, plain end, or user defined. I could set anything in here. I'm not going to change anything about this because I want my auto standard connections to stay the same. But there's some other settings in here that we could change. We could change our bolt types to supported or supporting, what our bolt diameter was, if we wanted to set any field clearances, and then a little bit about our connection specifications. So for our end plate, do we want to change our gauge for our plate? Do we want to have a safety connection? Do we want to use expanded vertical bolt spacing? We can combine beam and vertical brace end plates. Do we want welded extended T? And we can check supporting member for axial load. And this is all for end plate. So if I would change this, I'll change this for example. So for shear, we have a whole bunch of different connection specifications that we can change if we were using the shear input connection type. Like I said, in this case, I want to just stay with end plate, so I'm going to stay with end plate and I'm not going to change anything about my settings. I'm going to go ahead and say cancel here. And then I'm going to cancel, or I'm going to say okay out of this auto standard connections, so I didn't change anything, and I'm going to go back to my model. So another thing that we can look at inside of our model is our status display. So one thing I'm going to do is just kind of go over where we can open our status display from. So down here on our static toolbar, we can turn on and off our status display. Down here is we can browse for any presets that we might have. Right now it's just the default, and if I picked load, it would want me to choose a status display. And then to the right here, we actually have our status display button, so it's a little magnifying glass. I could click on that and it would open that window up. Or if I come up to my display page, in my display section, I do have a status display button here, and we can see that the keyboard shortcut is the question mark on your keyboard. So I like using my keyboard shortcut for my status display. I'm going to just hit shift question mark on my keyboard, and it's going to automatically pop up my status display window. Now what we can do in our status display window is we can set up any or different types of rules in how we want to view our model. So right now, just to go over kind of what we were looking at, I'm going to set mine to show an auto standard connection. So right now this rule is saying that I want to show in magenta any members that are an auto standard connection. And right now that's set to yes. So I'm just going to hit apply here just to show you what this can do. I'm going to say okay to this to get rid of this window. And now what our status display has done for us is it's highlighted in magenta any member that's using the auto standard connection type. So right away you can see how powerful the status display is, and we can filter out anything that we really want to see inside of our model. Now I'm going to bring that status display back up to kind of change this rule up a little bit. I could simply come in here and click this radio button and change it from yes to no. And now what that's going to do is that's kind of going to be the opposite of what we're showing here. So we're going to show in magenta any member that doesn't or isn't set to an auto standard connection. So if I hit apply here, everything that doesn't have an auto standard connection is highlighted in magenta now. So if I just double click on my vertical brace, we can see that the input connection type right here isn't set to auto standard. So it's going to show in magenta because that's what my rule is specifying. I can say cancel here. If we remember doing our stairs, I can go ahead and edit my stairs. The reason these are highlighted in magenta is because our connection types, again, on our left end or our bottom end is set to floor clip. And if I scroll down here, I can see my right end connection type settings, and those are set to clip angle. So that is why that member would be showing up in a magenta color. So another thing that we can do here inside of our model is we can show any of our connections that have been failed. So I'm going to pull up my status display again. And right now we have this set to show as an auto standard connection. So if I drop this down, there's a bunch of different rules that we can specify that we want to show as. If we come down here to the search flyout, we do have an option for failed connection. So if I click on failed connection, right now this rule is set up to show us anything in magenta for any member that has a failed connection. So if I apply this and say OK, we can see that inside of our model we have about 4 beams that are highlighted in magenta. So I'm going to zoom in on those because it's telling us that those are beams that have failed connections. So if we take a look at these beams here, we can see that they're kind of just a plain end on the beam. It does have a cope on the top flange there, but there's no material that's connecting this wide flange beam to this wide flange beam. So what I'm going to do, and we'll kind of transition back to our connection types here again, is I'm going to double click on this beam here, and right away in our beam edit window we can see that under our information tab we have a red flag or a message that is telling us why it is failing that member. So the reason that SDS2 is failing this member is because the coped beam web strength or buckling is exceeded. Now, a really handy thing that we can do here is if you do get a red flag message, we do get a failed button. So if I click on this, it is going to open a help menu that automatically jumps to that section. So this is the coped beam web stress or buckling exceeded up here is what we're getting. So it's going to automatically jump us to that section, and it's going to give us some more information on that failure message. So basically what it's saying here is some things we might be able to do is to change the input connection type. So that would be changing it from auto standard to like a clip angle or a shear type connection. We could choose a stronger beam or a section size. We could specify a steel grade with higher yield, or we could lower the shear loads. So however we would want to get around that failed message, it just gives us some more information here to go off of. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to X out of this quick. So one of the options it gave us is we could come to our connection type and we could change it from auto standard to clip angle, which is what we're going to want to do for this case. Or we could come down here to the loads section of our beam edit window, and this is where it was telling us we could change our load. So if I would uncheck this auto box, then I can type in my different loads that I think that I could adjust and maybe get that beam to use the auto standard connection type. In this case, what I want to do is I want to just change for my left and my right end settings. I want to change it from an auto standard connection to a clip angle connection. And as you can see, when I click on clip angle, this member goes through processing within this member edit screen, and now I'm not getting any red failed messages. And if I scroll down here towards the bottom, for my left end limit state and my right end limit state, it is going to tell me that my connection has passed now. So when I say OK, it's going to ask me, it's going to give me an alert message saying, do I want to change all B89? And it gives me a current quantity of 2. So I did edit this one that's kind of highlighted in green right now. It's asking me, since this beam right here is the same beam, if I want to change that one as well. So I'm going to actually go ahead and say yes, because I want both of these beams to have clip angle connections. And now we can see that once those beams go through processing, we have connections on both ends of these beams. We have them on the left and right end. Now another thing that I see being an issue with this beam and this beam, or this column really, is that it's putting a flange stiffener in here on this beam. So I want to actually get rid of this material here because we can see it's going about right directly through the center of that connection. So I don't want to see that. One thing that we can do here is we can come down here to our selection filter, and we can change that to material. Since this is a material that I want to get rid of, I can come and left click to highlight just that material, and then I'm going to simply just hit delete on my keyboard, and it's going to ask me if I want to delete this item. It's just one material. I'm going to say yes, and now that material is out of the way so that now I can make a connection for that beam. I'm going to come over here and do the same on the other side since I know it's happening on this side. I'm going to highlight that stiffener and I'm going to delete it. And now we have our connections made for our mezzanine level. As you notice, my status display is still on. So if I zoom out, we see a couple highlighted beams up front here, and we'll take a look at those in a second. But now that these beams are passing the connection, they automatically are not highlighted and they are not following my status display anymore because their connections are passing. So now I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to rotate around to the front of my building, and I'm going to take a look at why these beams would be failing. So we can see here they are kind of just plain ends like those other ones. They do have a cope out for the top flange, but we don't have any material that's making the connections. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to my selection filter, and I'm going to change that from material to default again. So now I can highlight my members and select my members again. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just double click to edit this beam. And you can see that under our left end settings, we aren't getting a failed message because it's not connecting to anything. For our right end settings, it's giving us that same message. So coped beam web strength or buckling exceeded. So what I'm going to do to get past this again is I'm going to come down to the connection type on the right end, and I'm going to change that from auto standard to clip angle. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and it's going to give us this alert again because we have two B52s. I'm going to say yes because I want to change both of them. And now we can see that we have a connection that is passing for our canopy. Now we are gonna have to go make the same changes to these beams over here. It's going to give us the same exact thing. So on my right end only, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to change from auto standard to clip angle. And then I'm going to say OK. And say yes again because I want to change the quantity of 2. And now both of our beams are now passing the connections. And now if I zoom out, our entire model for all of our members have passing connections. So the last thing I'll talk about in this video is how we can set up our status display to show for our different sequences. So if you remember at the very beginning when we were going through our project settings, we did create 4 different sequences that we can have our members follow. So there's a couple different ways that we can change our sequences. If we click on any one of our members in here and we just double click to pull up the member edit window, this is where we could come in here and we can change the sequence. Right now it's set to 1A for all of them. Now when we were adding in our beams and our columns, we could have gone through and specified which sequence was for which member, and we could have done it that way. Right now that I have all of my members in, I know that I'm going to split up my model kind of in different sections. So anything from here up is going to be in sequence 1A. Anything in this middle bay is going to be 2A. This will be 3A back here minus my mezzanine level. So this, anything highlighted here will be 3A, and then back here we'll make 4A. So there's a couple different ways we can do this. Again, we could come through here and we could double click on each separate member and change sequences that way. That would take quite a while to do. There is a different tool that we can use, so I'm going to just rotate around in a section view so I can highlight things easier. if I come up here to my search bar and I type in sequence, down here at the bottom, there is a set member sequence by area. So what this will allow us to do is set members to a different sequence. So I just clicked on that set member sequence by area. If we look at our status line, it's asking us to select members to sequence. So just to demonstrate this tool, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight everything back here. And I want all of these members to be in sequence 4A. So now that I have them highlighted, I'm going to right click and say OK. In my new sequence, I want to change from 1A to 4A. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to say OK here now that that's changed. And then it's going to ask us to select which sequences to modify. So right now, all of these members are in 1A. That's the one that I want to modify. I'm just going to say OK to this. And now when we click on these members here, if I double click to bring up this, we can see that the sequence is changed to 4A. So that's good. That's what I want those to be changed to. Another way we could do this is we could go, let's say, so all of these up here are set to 1A already. Let's say I want to change these in the middle to be 2A. So it might be a little bit more difficult to select these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into a view where I know I can see all the members in that section that I want to change. And I'm going to use my selection filter to my advantage again. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select beams, for example. I'm going to highlight all the beams in that section. And then in our ribbon up here, when I have all those highlighted, we see that we have a sequence that we can change, or a sequence section with a couple different tools in here. So I'm going to use the set member sequence by area again, and I want to change these to 2A. I'm going to say OK again. That's the one I want to change, so I'm going to say OK. So now if I rotate around, we can see that, okay, I got my beams, but I don't have my columns. So let's say I want to change back to default. I can select all of my columns. So I'm going to left click on that one, and then to select multiple, I'm going to hit shift on my keyboard, and I'm going to left click that column, left click that column, and I'm going to do that same process. So I'm going to come up here to set members sequence by area, say OK, because it's already set to 2A. I want to change it from 1A. So now all of those beams and columns in that area are going to be set to sequence 2A. And then let's say in this area right here, I want to choose all of my beams. I don't want those because those are going to be a part of 4A. I'm going to rotate around, and we have a couple that are missing here. So I'm going to hit my shift button, and I'm going to select this beam, and this beam. I'm going to come up to my sequence area here, and I want to change these to 3A. Say OK, OK again, and I want to change from 1A. And now the only things we have to do for this last 3A section is the columns. So what I can do here is I'm going to change my selection filter again to columns, and I'm going to highlight all my columns, come up to my sequence. It's already set to 3A. I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to change it from 1A to 3A. Now we did miss our vertical braces, so what we could do is I'm just going to change mine back to default since we only got a couple here. I'm going to highlight both of these, and I'm going to right click and say edit, and then we can come up here for both of these vertical braces and change it from 1A. In this case, I want that to be 2A. Say OK, say OK. And then we got a couple here in the back that we missed too. These are going to be a part of 3A, so I'm going to highlight these two vertical braces, and then I'm going to hit shift, and I'm going to highlight that last one, and then I'm going to right click and edit. And again, I'm going to come up here to my sequence. and I'm going to browse, and that's going to be a part of 3A. I'm going to say OK, and then say OK again to that edit screen. And now we should have all of our members in our specified sequences. So now what we can do is we can use our status display again to filter all of these out. So I'm going to launch my status display. Again, that's here on the magnifying glass. Down here is another icon, or you can hit your question mark on your keyboard to pull that up. So another thing that I wanted to show you is that you can have multiple priorities at the same time. So let's say we want to filter out by sequence. We want to see sequence 1 be shown in magenta. So I'm going to keep magenta set here. And then for my failed connection, I want to change that. So I'm going to change that from failed connection. And under general status options, we can choose a couple different things. So we want to filter out by sequence. So I'm going to choose sequence, and then I'm going to leave that from 1A to 1A. Now that I have this rule set up like this, I'm going to set up 3 more priorities and show you how that works. So there's a little green plus button. It says add below. So I'm going to hit that one time, and now we can do a different priority. So let's say for 2A, I want a different color. I want to show 2A in cyan, and then I'm going to browse here to show or to pick 2A. So priority 1 is saying we're going to highlight in magenta any member that is a part of sequence from 1A to 1A. And the priority 2 is showing in cyan any member that is a part of sequence 2A from 2A to 2A. So I'm going to do this a couple more times, and I'm going to change the color in the sequence. So for priority 3, let's say we want to see in green any members that are part of sequence 3A. And then in priority 4, let's go orange. And then we're going to change that from 2A to 4A. And now that we have all of these different priorities set up, I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. And then I'm going to OK out of this window so that we can see what we have set up here. So now what we have is we have all of our members in our different sections displayed by sequence. So we can see that we missed a couple here, so that's fine. We want these beams to be a part of section or sequence 3A. What we can do is we can just highlight this one, and right click and edit. And that's a part of 1A, so we can browse here. We want that to be a part of 3A. Can say OK and say OK. And now they're part, or they're being shown as a part of that sequence. Now 3A. So as you can see, this is a very powerful tool. You can use status displays to show you a lot of different things inside of your model.